An elderly man passes away, and his 3 sons fight over the inheritance. But when the will is read, everyone is shocked by what they inherit. The sky over Denver was gray that autumn afternoon, as if sensing the sadness that was about to fall upon the Simmons family. Walter, sitting in his worn leather armchair, gazed out the window with tired eyes. His 78 years felt heavier than ever as he held a trembling pen over a blank sheet of paper. "My dear children," he began to write, his once steady handwriting now shaky. "By the time you read this, I will be gone. I hope you can understand." A sudden tightness in his chest interrupted his words. The pen dropped, rolling across the polished wooden floor. Walter gasped, clutching the arm of the chair. His final thought was a mix of regret and hope. Regret for the lost years. Hope that his legacy could fix what was broken. Miles away, Sarah Simmons was in the middle of a tense meeting when her phone buzzed. She frowned at the sight of her father's lawyer's name on the screen. With a quick gesture of apology to her fellow executives, she answered the call. "Miss Simmons," the lawyer's deep voice came from the other end. "I'm sorry to inform you, but your father—" Sarah felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The following words became a blur as she struggled to process the news. Her father, the man she had admired so much and, in recent years, had neglected, was gone. In Las Vegas, Brian Simmons sat at a poker table, his eyes locked on the cards in front of him. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he calculated his odds. Everything was on the line, the chance to pay off his debts, to finally escape the creditors chasing him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. Nothing could be more important than this moment. When he finally checked his messages hours later, Brian felt the weight of guilt crash down on him. His father had died, and he had been too busy gambling to answer the phone. Michael Simmons, the youngest, was distributing supplies in a remote village when he received the news. His face, usually glowing with compassion, twisted into a mask of pain. He stepped away from the group, seeking a moment of privacy to process his grief. "Dad," he whispered to the starry sky, silent tears streaming down his cheeks. "I hope you're at peace." Back at the Simmons mansion, the silence was broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock. Walter's body had already been removed, but his presence still lingered in the air. On the coffee table, the unfinished letter remained, a silent testament to words left unsaid and secrets yet to be revealed. As night fell over Denver, 3 brothers, separated by miles and years of resentment, prepared for a meeting that would change their lives forever. None of them knew that hidden in their father's house, a locked box held revelations that would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about their family. The tension in the Simmons mansion's living room was palpable. Sarah, Brian, and Michael sat in silence, avoiding eye contact with each other as they waited for Mr. Thompson, the family's attorney. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to echo through the room, marking every second of a wait that felt endless. Finally, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Jenkins, the housekeeper, announced Mr. Thompson's arrival. The attorney, a middle-aged man with thin-rimmed glasses and a well-pressed suit, entered the room carrying a black leather briefcase. "Good afternoon, everyone," he greeted them solemnly. "I deeply regret the loss of your father. Walter was not only a client but a dear friend." Sarah was the first to speak, her voice tense with impatience. "Let's get straight to the point, Mr. Thompson. What does the will say?" The attorney nodded, sitting in an armchair across from the siblings. He opened the briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This is Walter Simmons' final will, updated just 3 months ago." Brian leaned forward, his eyes shining with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. Michael remained still, his face a mask of forced calm. Mr. Thompson broke the seal and began to read. I, Walter Simmons, being of sound mind, declare this to be my last will and testament. As the attorney continued, the siblings' expressions shifted from anticipation to disbelief and finally to utter shock. And therefore I leave the entirety of my estate, including properties, investments, and bank accounts, to the creation of the Simmons Foundation for the greater good. What? Sarah shouted, jumping to her feet. This can't be right! Brian, pale as a ghost, stammered, A foundation? What foundation? Dad never mentioned anything about this. Michael, though visibly disturbed, remained seated, his eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Mr. Thompson raised a hand, asking for silence. Please, let me finish. There's more. He continued reading. The Simmons Foundation will be managed jointly by my 3 children, Sarah, Brian, and Michael. They will work together to determine how best to use the Foundation's resources to benefit our community and beyond. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. This is ridiculous. We can barely stay in the same room without fighting, and now he expects us to run a foundation together? There must be some mistake, Brian insisted, his voice trembling. Or maybe he wasn't in his right mind when he wrote this. Michael, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. No, Brian. Dad knew exactly what he was doing. He turned to the attorney. Mr. Thompson, is there anything else we need to know? The attorney nodded gravely. Yes, Michael. Walter left specific instructions. He hid clues and information about the foundation and its goals throughout the house. You will have to work together to uncover the true purpose of the Simmons Foundation. A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah sank back into her chair, her face a mask of anger and confusion. Brian ran his hands through his hair, mumbling incoherently about injustice. Michael, on the other hand, seemed to be struggling internally, torn between respecting his father's decision and his loyalty to his siblings. Is that all? Sarah asked, her voice dripping with venom. He leaves us with nothing but an elaborate treasure hunt? Mr. Thompson closed his briefcase with a sigh. Walter believed this would bring you together, that it would help you rediscover the meaning of family. He hoped that by working together to solve this mystery, you could heal the wounds of the past. Michael stood up slowly, looking at his siblings. Well, it looks like we've got work to do. Whether we like it or not, this was our father's wish. I think we should at least try to understand what he wanted. The sun had barely risen when Sarah, Brian, and Michael gathered in the Simmons mansion's living room. The shock of the revelation about the foundation still hung in the air, mixed with frustration and curiosity. Well, Sarah said, breaking the tense silence, we're not going to find answers by just standing here. Let's start searching the house. Brian nodded eagerly. I agree. The sooner we figure out what's going on, the better. Michael hesitated. I'm not sure we should be invading Dad's privacy like this. What privacy, Michael? Sarah interrupted, exasperated. He's gone and left us with nothing. We have a right to know why. Reluctantly, Michael agreed, and the 3 of them began their search. Sarah took the office, Brian the master bedroom, and Michael headed to the attic. In the office, Sarah meticulously rummaged through drawers and cabinets. Her executive mind cataloged each item, searching for patterns or clues. It was when she opened a hidden drawer in the desk that she found something intriguing, a folder full of newspaper clippings. What is this? She muttered to herself, flipping through the articles. They were stories about local families facing hardships, job losses, health issues, natural disasters. But what caught her attention were the notes scribbled in the margins, written in her father's familiar handwriting. In the master bedroom, Brian was rifling through Walter's closet when his hand brushed against a hidden shoebox. Inside, he found dozens of thank you letters. Dear Mr. Simmons, he read aloud, I don't know how to thank you for your generosity. The money you anonymously donated saved our farm. Brian felt a lump in his throat. The father he had always seen as a ruthless businessman had a side he had never known. In the dusty attic, Michael discovered something that made his heart sink. A photo album he had never seen before. On the yellowed pages, he found pictures of his father in places he didn't recognize: poor neighborhoods, shelters, run-down schools. In every photo, Walter was smiling, surrounded by grateful faces. "Guys," Michael called out, coming down the stairs with the album, "you need to see this." The siblings gathered in the living room, each bringing their discoveries. As they shared what they had found, a different picture of Walter Simmons began to emerge. "I don't get it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Why didn't he ever tell us about this?" Brian flipped through the letters, his face a mix of confusion and regret. "Look at this date. It was right after I asked to borrow money for the third time. He told me he couldn't help anymore, but here he is, donating to strangers." Michael watched his siblings, noticing how the revelations were affecting them. Sarah, always so focused on her career, now seemed lost, questioning her priorities. Brian, on the other hand, grew more agitated, as if their father's good deeds only deepened his own despair. "There's got to be more," Brian insisted, standing up abruptly. "Somewhere we haven't looked yet." That's when Sarah had an idea. "The basement. Dad always kept that door locked." The three of them descended the creaky stairs to the dark basement. Sarah found the light switch, and a dim glow revealed dusty shelves and stacked boxes. "There," Michael pointed to a leather trunk in the corner. Together, they opened the trunk. On top, there was a thick, leather-bound journal. Sarah picked it up with trembling hands and began reading aloud. June 10th. Today, I used some of the company's profits to help the Johnson family. Their son needs urgent surgery, and insurance won't cover it. I can't bear to see a child suffer when I have the means to help. The following pages revealed an extensive network of secret philanthropic activities. Walter had created an elaborate system to channel a large part of his fortune to causes and people in need, all done with the utmost discretion. "He was a secret hero," Michael murmured in admiration. Sarah closed the journal, her expression a mix of pride and shame. "All this time I thought he was being stingy by not investing more in the company, but he was doing something much bigger." Brian remained silent, his mind racing. His father's good deeds, though admirable, meant less money for him, fewer chances to get out of the hole he had dug for himself. As they climbed back up to the living room, each sibling was lost in their own thoughts. Sarah questioned every career decision she had made, wondering if she had lost sight of what truly mattered. Michael felt a renewed connection to his father, seeing in him the role model he had always wanted to follow. And Brian felt the weight of his choices more than ever, his father's generosity painfully contrasting with his own greed. Sarah, Brian, and Michael decided it was time to leave the mansion and dig deeper into the mystery of their father's legacy. "Let's start with the neighborhood where Dad grew up," Michael suggested, pointing to one of the addresses in the diary. When they arrived at Walter's old neighborhood, the siblings were surprised by the contrast. Where there were once run-down houses, now there were clean streets and well-kept homes. "Look," Sarah said, pointing to a sign, "Walter Simmons Community Center." Inside the center, they were greeted by an elderly woman with bright eyes. "You must be Walter's children," she smiled. "I'm Martha, the coordinator here." Martha gave them a tour, explaining how Walter had transformed the neighborhood over the years. "He never wanted recognition," she said. "He always insisted on staying anonymous." Michael listened, fascinated and proud of his father's legacy. Sarah, however, felt a growing unease. As they left the center, Brian noticed a man watching them. "Hey, I know you," Brian said, approaching. "Didn't you work for Dad's company?" The man nodded, his face hardening. "Tom Parker. I was fired 10 years ago thanks to your sister." Sarah paled as she recognized the name. She had recommended a massive restructuring at the company, which resulted in hundreds of layoffs. "Mr. Parker, Sarah began, but Tom cut her off. "I don't need your apologies. Your father. Now he was a real man. After I lost my job, he secretly reached out to me. He helped me start my own business." Tom's words hit Sarah like a punch. She had always viewed those layoffs as necessary for the company's growth. Now, confronted with the human consequences of her decisions, she felt deeply ashamed. The siblings continued their journey through the neighborhood, each stop revealing more about Walter's quiet impact on the community. Michael soaked it all in with growing admiration, seeing in his father the model of compassion he had always aspired to be. Brian, on the other hand, wrestled with conflicting emotions. Walter's generosity made him feel even guiltier about his own selfish choices. Their last stop took them to a small flower shop. As they entered, they were greeted by a middle-aged woman with a warm smile. "How can I help you?" she asked. Sarah stepped forward, her face pale. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm Sarah Simmons." The woman's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of shock and then anger. "You've got some nerve showing up here," she said, her voice trembling. Michael and Brian looked at Sarah confused, as she seemed on the verge of breaking down. "What's going on?" Michael asked. Mrs. Johnson pointed at Sarah. "Your sister nearly destroyed our family. Her company bought our land for a pittance, promising a fair deal. We lost everything." Sarah lowered her head, unable to deny it. It was one of the first big deals she had closed, manipulating an unsuspecting family to get a valuable piece of land. "But then," Mrs. Johnson continued, her voice softening, "your father showed up. He bought this place for us, helped us start over. We never knew why, but now—" The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked at her brothers, seeing a mix of shock and disappointment in their faces. I'm so sorry," Sarah finally managed to say, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know. I never imagined." Mrs. Johnson watched her for a moment, then sighed. "Your father taught us about forgiveness. Maybe it's time to put that into practice." As they left the shop, each sibling was lost in thought. Walter's legacy had become a mirror, forcing them to confront the truths about themselves they had long tried to ignore. "I think we have a lot to talk about," Michael said quietly as they walked back to the car. Sarah and Brian only nodded, knowing that their journey of self-discovery and redemption was just beginning. The return to the Simmons mansion was silent. Sarah, Brian, and Michael, each weighed down by the day's revelations, barely spoke during the drive. Once they arrived, Sarah headed straight to Walter's office, determined to face her past. She grabbed the phone and with trembling fingers dialed a number. "Hello, Mr. Thompson. This is Sarah Simmons. We need to talk about the Riverview agreement." On the other end, the company's lawyer became visibly nervous. "Sarah, are you sure? That case has been closed for years." "No, it hasn't," she replied firmly. "We're reopening it. I want to make things right for all the families we hurt." As Sarah buried herself in spreadsheets and old documents, Brian paced restlessly around the house. The stress of recent discoveries consumed him, and he felt the familiar itch of addiction creeping back. "Just one online game," he muttered to himself, grabbing his laptop, just to ease the tension. Hours passed. The sun was already setting when Sarah finally emerged from the office, exhausted but determined. She found Michael in the kitchen, making coffee. "Where's Brian?" she asked. Michael shrugged. "I haven't seen him since we got back." Worried, they went to look for their brother. They found him in the guest room, his eyes glued to the computer screen, surrounded by empty energy drink cans. "Brian?" Sarah called softly. He turned around, his face pale and sweaty. I messed up, he stammered. I took out an online loan. I thought I could win it back, but... Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of disappointment. How much? 50,000, Brian whispered, the shame clear in his voice. Sarah sighed deeply. We'll figure this out, she said, surprising herself with the calm in her voice. But Brian, you need help. This can't go on. The next morning, Sarah prepared for the meeting she dreaded the most. She had arranged to meet the Johnson family, determined to make amends. Arriving at the small flower shop, Sarah found not only Mrs. Johnson, but her entire family. Mr. Johnson, a tired-looking man, and their 2 grown sons eyed her with a mix of curiosity and resentment. Thank you for seeing me, Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. I'm here to apologize and to make things right. She then explained her compensation plan, offering not just financial restitution, but also business and educational opportunities for the couple's children. Mrs. Johnson, who had initially kept a stern expression, gradually softened. Walter would be proud, she finally said, tears welling up in her eyes. Those words hit Sarah deeply. For the first time in years, she felt she was on the right path. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Michael continued his investigation into their father's past. Rifling through a hidden drawer in the office, he found a folder marked Confidential. Curious, he opened it, and his eyes widened at what he saw. They were documents detailing several questionable transactions, all directly linked to Sarah. Oh my God, he murmured, realizing the extent of his sister's actions. At that moment, Brian entered the office looking nervous. Mike, I need to go to a meeting, he said hesitantly. Michael looked at his brother, immediately understanding. Gamblers Anonymous? Brian nodded, ashamed. It's the first step, right? Michael smiled, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. It's a big step, Brian. I'm proud of you. When Sarah returned that evening, she found her brothers in the living room. The atmosphere was tense, filled with unspoken secrets and confessions. How did it go with the Johnsons? Michael asked, trying to hide his concern. Sarah smiled tiredly. Better than I expected. I think I'm finally on the right track. Michael hesitated, the documents he had found weighing heavily on his mind. Sarah, there's something we need to talk about. Before he could continue, the phone rang. It was the family lawyer, his voice urgent on the other end of the line. You need to come to my office immediately, he said. There's something about your father's foundation that you need to know. The siblings exchanged glances, sensing that they were on the brink of yet another revelation that could change everything. Walter Simmons's legacy continued to unfold, challenging them to face not only their past, but also their uncertain future. The lawyer's office was steeped in tense silence as Sarah, Brian, and Michael entered. Mr. Thompson, usually a composed man, appeared nervous, shuffling papers on his desk. Please, have a seat, he said, gesturing to the chairs in front of him. What I have to show you is delicate. He slid a folder across the table. These are Walter's final instructions for the foundation. He set specific conditions for each of you. Sarah was the first to grab the folder, her eyes scanning the document quickly. Her expression shifted from curiosity to shock, then to anger. This can't be right, she murmured, handing the papers to Brian. Brian read, his face turning pale. He can't do this to us, he said, his voice trembling. Michael, the last to read, closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Dad knew everything. The silence that followed was broken by the lawyer. Walter wanted you to prove your worth before receiving any part of the inheritance. He set specific challenges for each of you. Sarah stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous! I've built an empire! An empire built on lies and exploitation, Michael shot back, unable to contain his frustration anymore. Sensing the growing tension, Brian tried to intervene. Guys, let's talk about this at home. But it was too late. Years of resentment and secrets began to spill over. You have no right to speak, Brian, Sarah lashed out. Do you think we don't know about your gambling debts? About the money you stole from the company? Brian flinched as if he'd been slapped. How did you— I've always known, Sarah continued, relentless. I kept it a secret to protect the family's reputation. But now, maybe it's time for the truth to come out. Michael stepped between them. Enough! Don't you see what you're doing? Sarah turned to him, her eyes blazing with fury. Oh, don't act all high and mighty, Michael, living off Dad's fortune while playing the world's savior. At least I didn't destroy lives in the name of profit, Michael retorted. The lawyer, visibly uncomfortable, tried to calm the situation. Please, let's all calm down and discuss this civilly. But it was too late. Years of rivalry and bitterness had finally reached a boiling point. Feeling cornered, Sarah decided to play her final card. Brian, if you don't back me up on this, I swear I'll go to the police and expose your frauds. Brian grew even paler. You wouldn't. I'm your brother. Don't you dare, Sarah, Michael intervened, his voice dangerously low. If you do that, I'll expose all your dirty dealings myself. I have enough evidence to bring down your precious company. The silence that followed was deafening. The three siblings stared at each other, years of family love dissolving into a sea of betrayal and threats. The lawyer, sensing the gravity of the situation, made one last attempt. Ladies and gentlemen, please. This isn't what Walter wanted. He hoped you would come together, learn from your mistakes. His words, however, fell on deaf ears. Sarah was the first to move, grabbing her purse and heading for the door. It's over, she said, her voice cold. I'll contest this will with everything I've got. You two can go to hell. Brian followed, casting one last look of despair at Michael. I'm sorry, he murmured before leaving. Michael stayed behind, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looked at the lawyer, who seemed as defeated as he felt. What do we do now? Michael asked, more to himself than to the lawyer. Mr. Thompson sighed deeply. Honestly, I don't know. But Walter left one last letter to be opened in case something like this happened. Maybe we'll find some guidance there. Michael nodded, taking the sealed envelope the lawyer handed him. As he left the office, he couldn't help but wonder if there was any hope of saving his family, or if Walter Simmons's legacy was destined to be the end of the bonds that had once held them together. Michael had spent the entire night awake, the envelope left by Walter weighing heavily in his hands. At dawn, unable to bear the tension any longer, he called Sarah and Brian. We need to talk, he said simply. At Dad's house, in an hour. Surprisingly, they both agreed. An hour later, the three siblings met in the Simmons mansion's living room. The silence was palpable, thick with resentment and regret. I found this, Michael said, showing the envelope. It's Dad's final message. Sarah and Brian exchanged uneasy glances. Let's just get this over with, Sarah murmured. Michael carefully opened the envelope and began reading aloud. My dear children, if you're reading this, it means I failed in my last wish, to bring you back together as a family. But maybe this truth can do what I couldn't in life. The foundation I created isn't just about charity, it's about redemption, my redemption. 40 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. Michael paused, his voice faltering. The three siblings looked at each other, shocked. As he continued reading, they uncovered a shocking truth. Early in his career, Walter had been responsible for an environmental disaster that devastated a small community. Using his connections and money, he had managed to cover up his involvement. The weight of this secret has consumed me for decades, the letter went on. The foundation was my attempt to make amends, to help those I harmed and so many others. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. Brian sank into the couch, stunned. Michael, his voice thick with emotion, kept reading. My beloved children, I didn't just make one mistake back then. My greatest failure was not trusting you, not sharing this burden with you. I tried to protect you, but in doing so, I pushed you away. The foundation isn't just my redemption, it's a chance for you too. A chance to make a difference, to correct my mistakes, and your own. The silence that followed was deafening. Each sibling, lost in their own thoughts, reflected on the revelations and their own actions. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. All these years, I thought I was following in his footsteps, but I was just repeating his mistakes. Brian nodded, tears in his eyes. I've always felt like a failure compared to him. Maybe that's why I fell so deep into addiction. Michael looked at his siblings, feeling a wave of compassion he hadn't felt in years. He wanted us to learn from his mistakes, not repeat them. The letter went on, detailing how the foundation should operate, focusing on helping communities affected by environmental disasters and supporting families in need. The true legacy I want to leave, Walter concluded, is not money or power, but the chance to make a difference, to be better than I was. Together, you can turn this foundation into something extraordinary. You can redeem yourselves, just as I tried to redeem myself. Remember, forgiveness starts at home. Forgive each other, and maybe you can forgive me too. With all my love, Dad. When Michael finished reading, the silence in the room was different. It was no longer tense or hostile, but thoughtful. Sarah was the first to move, stepping closer to her brothers. I'm sorry. For everything. Brian, tears in his eyes, nodded. Me too, I've been a fool. Michael looked at his siblings, a small smile forming on his lips. I think we all have. But maybe it's not too late to change. In that moment, something shifted between the Simmons siblings. Walter's revelations, though painful, opened a door to forgiveness and understanding. What now? Brian asked, looking at Sarah and Michael. Sarah took a deep breath. Now, we honor Dad's wish. We make this foundation something that truly makes a difference. Michael nodded, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in days. Together, he said, extending his hand. Sarah and Brian placed their hands on top of Michael's. Together, they agreed. There, in the room where they had grown up, the Simmons siblings took the first step toward redemption, not just their father's, but their own. The days following the revelation of Walter's letter were filled with deep introspection for the Simmons siblings. The mansion, once the stage for bitter disputes, now witnessed honest conversations and moments of vulnerability. Sarah was the first to take concrete action. On a sunny morning, she gathered her brothers in the kitchen. I'm stepping down as CEO, she announced, surprising Brian and Michael. I need to fix what I've done wrong before I can lead again. Michael nodded, impressed by his sister's change. That's a brave decision, Sarah. How can we help? Sarah smiled, grateful for the support. I'll need you both to help me identify all the people and communities I've harmed over the years. I want to make amends, one by one. Brian, who had been quiet, finally spoke up. I scheduled my first therapy session and a meeting with Gamblers Anonymous. His siblings hugged him, proud of his effort. That's a big step, Brian, Sarah said, squeezing her brother's hand. In the days that followed, Sarah dove into an exhaustive process of reviewing all the company's business dealings. She spent hours on the phone, scheduling meetings with former employees, business partners, and even competitors she had wronged. One afternoon, she returned from one of those meetings, visibly shaken. How did it go? Michael asked, offering her a cup of tea. Sarah sighed as she accepted the drink. It was tough. Mr. Johnson, the one whose land I took, he cried when I apologized. He said he had waited years to hear that. Michael smiled gently. You're doing the right thing, Sarah. It's not easy, but it's necessary. Meanwhile, Brian was facing his own demons. After his first Gamblers Anonymous meeting, he came home trembling. How do you feel? Sarah asked, noticing his state. Brian collapsed onto the couch. Exposed. Scared. But relieved, too. For the first time in years, I feel like I can really change. The siblings spent the evening talking, with Brian sharing his struggles and fears. while Sarah and Michael offered unconditional support. As the days went by, a new dynamic emerged among the siblings. Old rivalries gave way to a shared sense of purpose. It was during one of these late-night conversations that Michael presented his idea. "I've been thinking," he began, spreading some papers on the kitchen table. "What if we turned Dad's foundation into something bigger?" Sarah and Brian leaned in, curious. "Imagine," Michael continued, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm, "an organization that not only helps communities affected by environmental disasters, but also works on prevention. We could use Sarah's business expertise to create sustainable partnerships. Brian, your experience dealing with addiction could be invaluable for rehabilitation programs." The other two siblings listened, captivated. "It's ambitious," Sarah said, a smile forming on her lips. "But I think it's exactly what Dad wanted." Brian nodded, excited. "I can help develop support programs for families affected by addiction. I know firsthand how it can destroy lives." The three of them spent hours discussing possibilities, sketching plans, and dreaming about the future. For the first time in years, they were truly united, working together toward a common goal. By the time they finally went to bed, it was already dawn. Sarah paused in the hallway, looking at Walter's portrait. "I think I finally get it, Dad," she whispered. "It's not just about fixing mistakes, but about creating something better for the future." The next day, the Simmons siblings scheduled a meeting with the family lawyer. It was time to put their plans into action, to transform Walter's legacy into something that could truly make a difference. As they prepared to leave, each of them felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, they were facing it together. "Ready?" Michael asked, standing at the door. Sarah and Brian exchanged glances, then nodded. "Ready," they answered in unison. And so, the Simmons siblings took their first step on their journey of redemption, not only honoring their father's memory but also forging their own path toward a better future. The Thompson law firm office was tense when the Simmons siblings arrived. Mr. Thompson's worried expression indicated that something serious was about to happen. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said, motioning for them to sit. "We have a problem." Sarah, Brian, and Michael exchanged anxious glances. "Some minority shareholders of the company found out about the foundation," Thompson continued. "They're threatening to sue, claiming that Walter didn't have the right to donate such a significant portion of the company's assets." Sarah paled. "But the company was his. He could do whatever he wanted with it." Thompson shook his head. "It's not that simple. They argue that, as shareholders, they are entitled to a portion of those assets. If they go through with this, it could turn into a long and costly lawsuit." Brian, nervous, asked, "What can we do?" "You have two options," Thompson replied. "You can contest the will, claiming Walter wasn't of sound mind when he made it. This would probably please the shareholders and avoid the lawsuit. Or, Michael pressed. "Or you can accept the will as it is, honor your father's wishes, and face a potentially devastating legal battle." The silence that followed was heavy. Each sibling, lost in their own thoughts, weighed the implications of this choice. Sarah was the first to speak. "How much time do we have to decide?" "The shareholders' lawyers gave a 48-hour deadline," Thompson answered. "After that, they'll file the lawsuit." Michael stood up, walking to the window. "We need to talk about this. Privately." Thompson nodded, understanding. "Of course. Use my conference room. I'll be here when you've made your decision." The siblings withdrew to the next room. As soon as the door closed, the tension exploded. "We can't let them destroy Dad's legacy," Michael said firmly. Sarah sighed heavily. "But at what cost, Michael? If we lose this legal battle, we could lose everything. Not just the foundation, but the entire company." Brian, feeling the weight of the decision, intervened. Maybe we should contest the will." We could use the money to do good in other ways. Michael looked at his siblings in disbelief. After everything we found out? After everything we promised to do? It's not that simple, Sarah argued. We have responsibilities, employees who depend on the company. If it sinks in this legal battle. The argument intensified. Voices rose, old resentments threatened to resurface. For hours they debated, weighing every option, every consequence. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Michael paused. He walked to the window, looking out over the city below. "You know," he began, his voice calm, "I've spent years working with underserved communities. I've seen the impact a single action can have. Dad understood that in the end. He saw that he could use his power to make a difference." Sarah and Brian listened intently. "If we contest the will," Michael continued, "we're saying that money is more important than the legacy, that our comfort matters more than the good we can do." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her brother's words. "But what if we lose everything?" Michael turned, facing his siblings. "What if we win? What if, by fighting this battle, we inspire others to do the same? It's not just about us anymore. It's about what we represent." Brian, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "He's right. I've spent years running from consequences. Maybe it's time to face them." Sarah looked at her brothers, seeing in them a determination she hadn't seen in years. She thought about all the people she had wronged, the lives she could change. "Okay," she finally said, "let's do this, let's fight." The tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. The Simmons siblings, once divided by ambition and resentment, were now united by a common goal. When they returned to Thompson's office, their expressions were resolute. "Well?" the lawyer asked, anxious. Michael looked at Sarah and Brian, who nodded in agreement. "We're going to honor our father's wishes," Michael declared. "We're ready to fight." Thompson smiled, a mix of pride and concern in his eyes. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Nothing worth it ever is," Sarah replied, her voice steady. As they left the office, the Simmons siblings knew they were embarking on their greatest battle, but for the first time in years, they were facing it together, united by their father's legacy and the promise of a better future. The days following the Simmons siblings' decision were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah, Brian, and Michael dove headfirst into preparations for the official launch of the Walter Simmons Foundation. Sarah, using her business acumen, led the organization of the charity event. "We need to show the community that we're committed," she explained during a family meeting. "Not just with words, but with real action." Brian, on the other hand, focused on establishing connections with support groups and rehabilitation centers. "I want this foundation to be a beacon of hope for those struggling with addiction," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Michael coordinated efforts to identify the most disadvantaged communities. "Let's start with the neighborhood where Dad grew up," he suggested. "We need to show we're serious about repairing the damage from the past." As their plans progressed, the siblings encountered unexpected resistance. Rumors about Walter's past began to circulate, fueled by disgruntled shareholders and skeptical community members. "How can we trust them?" questioned a community leader during a tense meeting. "Their father caused so much harm. How do we know they won't do the same?" Sarah, feeling the weight of those words, stepped forward. "We're not asking for blind trust," she replied. "We're asking for a chance to prove we can be better, to correct the mistakes of the past." Brian added, "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we choose to fix them." Slowly, with persistence and transparency, the siblings began to earn the community's support. Each small victory brought them closer together, strengthening the bond that had been so fragile for so long. On the eve of the big event, the three gathered in Walter's old office. Michael raised a toast. "To Dad's memory and to the future we're building together, The day of the launch arrived, bringing with it a mix of nerves and hope. The event hall was elegantly decorated, with photos of Walter and the communities the foundation aimed to help displayed on the walls. Sarah, impeccable in a blue suit, opened the event. Welcome. Today we're not just launching a foundation, but starting a journey of redemption and hope. Brian followed, his voice trembling slightly. Many of you knew our father, Walter Simmons. Some admired him, others feared him. Today, we want to show you the man he became at the end of his life. Someone determined to right his wrongs and make a difference. Michael concluded, "The Walter Simmons Foundation isn't about us. It's about you, about our community, about building a better future together." As the evening progressed, the siblings mingled with the guests, sharing their vision and listening to the community's needs. The initial skepticism began to give way to cautious optimism. The most emotional moment of the night came when an elderly woman approached the stage. It was Martha, the coordinator of the community center Walter had secretly supported for years. "I met Walter Simmons in his later years," she began, her voice fragile but firm. "I saw a man haunted by his past, but determined to make a difference. He never sought recognition, always insisted on anonymity, but today, I see his children continuing his work, and I know he would be proud." Silent tears ran down the faces of the Simmons siblings as Martha spoke. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Sarah, Brian, and Michael took the stage together to thank Martha. In that moment, feeling the warmth of the community's support, they knew they were on the right path. The event was a success beyond their expectations. Donations began pouring in, partnerships were formed, and the community started to see the Simmons siblings in a new light. Later that night, after the last guest had left, the three siblings found themselves back in Walter's office. "We did it, Dad," whispered Sarah, looking up at Walter's portrait. Brian smiled, wrapping an arm around each sibling. "This is just the beginning." Michael nodded, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "We've got a long road ahead, but together we can do it." As they watched the sunrise through the window, the Simmons siblings felt a renewed sense of purpose. Walter's legacy was no longer a burden, but a guiding light toward a better future. The autumn sun painted the Oakville sky with shades of orange and gold, reflecting off the windows of the Simmons mansion. In the backyard, Sarah, Brian, and Michael sat in wicker chairs around a tea table. The silence between them was no longer tense or uncomfortable, but contemplative and serene. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "It's been a year since we launched the foundation," she said, holding her teacup with both hands. "Sometimes I still can't believe everything that's happened." Brian nodded, a soft smile on his lips. "I know. If someone had told me a year ago that we'd be here like this, I would have laughed in their face." Michael looked at his siblings, his eyes shining with contained emotion. "I think we've all learned a lot this past year. About ourselves, about each other, about what really matters in life." The three of them sat quietly for a moment, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The reading of Walter's will, the treasure hunt for the clues left in the house, the painful confrontations with past mistakes, and finally, the discovery of the true purpose behind the Simmons Foundation. "You know," Sarah began, her voice softer than usual, "I always thought success meant having more money, more power, more status. But now—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Now I understand that real success is about giving more, about making a difference in other people's lives." Brian reached out and took Sarah's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "I know exactly what you mean. I spent so much time trying to fill a void with gambling and empty thrills. But working with the foundation, Seeing the impact we can have, now that's exciting." Michael smiled, proud of his siblings. Dad always knew, didn't he? He knew we had it in us. We just needed a push in the right direction. The three siblings looked at each other, and suddenly, the remaining barriers between them crumbled. Sarah was the first to stand, pulling her brothers into a tight hug. Silent tears streamed down their faces as they held on to each other. Years of hurt and resentment finally washed away. "I'm so sorry," Sarah sobbed, "for everything. For the way I treated you, for being so selfish." "We all made mistakes," Brian responded, his voice thick with emotion. "What matters is that we're here now, together." Michael tightened the hug. "We're a family, a real family now." When they finally pulled apart, there was a new light in their eyes, a glow of determination and hope. "So," Michael said, wiping away his tears with the back of his hand, "what are your plans going forward?" Sarah straightened her shoulders, a determined smile on her face. "I've decided to use my business skills for something good. I'm thinking of starting a mentoring program for young social entrepreneurs." Brian nodded enthusiastically. "That's amazing, Sarah. As for me, well, I've decided to go back to school. I want to specialize in nonprofit management. I think I can really make a difference in that field." Michael looked at his siblings with pride. "You two are incredible. I've decided to accept that offer to lead a sustainable development project in Africa. But don't worry, I'll always come back and stay involved with the foundation." The three smiled at each other, feeling truly united for the first time in years. 1 year later, the auditorium at Oakville High School was packed. On stage, Sarah Simmons was handing out certificates to a group of young social entrepreneurs, their faces beaming with pride. In the front row, Brian clapped enthusiastically, a folder with his newly earned degree in nonprofit management by his side. In the back of the room, Michael watched the scene with a smile, having just returned from his latest trip to Africa. His sustainable development project was changing lives, and he couldn't wait to share the news with his siblings. The Simmons Foundation for the Common Good had become a beacon of hope in the community. Its initiatives had created jobs, improved education and health care, and inspired a new generation of community leaders. But the deepest and most lasting impact of the Simmons siblings' choices could be seen in themselves. The faces once hardened by ambition and resentment now glowed with purpose and contentment. They had found something far more valuable than any material inheritance. They had rediscovered the meaning of family and the power of a legacy of love. As Sarah finished her speech, she looked at her brothers and smiled. Somewhere she knew her father was smiling too. Walter Simmons's final wish wasn't just about creating a foundation. It was about bringing his family together and showing them the true meaning of wealth and success. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the community they had helped strengthen, Sarah, Brian, and Michael Simmons knew they had finally honored their father's legacy in the most meaningful way possible. Not just with their actions, but with their transformed hearts. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts or suggestions for new stories in the comments. Subscribe to the channel to follow more heartwarming narratives like this one. Remember, every choice we make has the power to transform our destiny.